Hello, everyone. If you allow me, maybe the introduction, I'm going to do it in Spanish in this occasion. Hola a todos, muchas gracias por su participación. Qué bueno que están aquí el día de hoy con nosotros. Ya Nicola, ya también es un gusto verla aquí con nosotros después de que pues tuvo este problema con este bendito COVID. Pero bueno, antes que nada, y aparte de agradecerle su participación, también quiero aprovechar para felicitar a todas todas las mamás que están con nosotros el día de hoy, que se han tomado un tiempo también para estar en este evento. Muchas felicidades a todas ustedes, a todas a todas las mamás de todos aquellos que están participando. Muchas gracias y sin más, pues empecemos. Muchas gracias, Nicola. Te cedo la palabra.
Thanks very much, Humberto, and good to be with you all again. I will just share my screen and then we can get underway. Okay, can I just check that everyone can see that whole screen okay?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
Perfect. Okay, so this is our third session of 4 on TCFD, and I think this is one of the most interesting sessions because this is the focus on the strategy and metrics and targets disclosures under the TCFD regime. And so today I'm going to do very similar to what we did on the last session and work through in detail what's required under the developing strategy disclosures internationally, and then under the metrics and targets disclosures. So just as a quick recap of where we are, we've covered the governance and risk management pieces in the the session last time, and so now we're on to strategy and metrics. The strategy part of the TCFD disclosures for reporting entities is the most relevant for investors and the most relevant and important piece for businesses and financial entities that are doing TCFD assessment and preparing disclosures. And the reason for that is that this is the part of the report where you actually assess what your climate-related risks and opportunities are and disclose those, and you also disclose what the impact is on your strategy of those risks and opportunities. So it's really the heart of the report where you explain what it is you've figured out that's important for your particular business and what you're doing about it. And so if you want to sort of look at a TCFD report and figure out if it's a good, substantive, carefully thought through report, you can usually go straight to the strategy section and look at how much detail and assessment has gone into this piece of the reporting. The metrics and targets part of the reporting sits nicely alongside the strategy piece. Metrics and targets is the part of the report where you actually give usually quantitative metrics to explain how you have performed so far on your management of climate risks and management of climate opportunities. So that's where we get lots of data, and I'll go through quite a lot of examples of lots of different metrics that are used, some of the most common ones that are used, particularly in the banking sector, for you all to get a real sense of how that works in practice. And then targets are the specific part of the TCFD report where you do actually specify targets. So you don't just report on what you have done in your metrics, but you're reporting on where you want to go. And so your targets will often align nicely with some of the points you're making in your strategy section around opportunities. So here we are. This is where we're at in the TCFD structure. So the way we're going to break down the strategy section is we're going to look at, if you can see on the A line there under strategy. So this is describing the risks and opportunities the organization has identified over the short, medium, and long term. describing the impact of those risks and opportunities on the organization's businesses, strategy, and financial planning. And the key, that's really the heart of it. And the key change that we've seen in the international space over the last year or so is a lot more detail around those disclosures and a lot more expectation of quantitative assessment in that piece of the disclosures. And then the third part is describing the resilience of the strategy. So not only do you have to work out what your strategy is and disclose what you're going to do, you then need to take a step back and think about how resilient your strategy is, measuring that against a range of realistic climate change scenarios. And this is where we get scenario analysis, which is one of the most difficult parts of TCFD reporting, and one of the pieces of this that is, really just at early stages of development internationally, which we'll look at in a little bit of, we'll look at it briefly today, and then we might look at it in a bit more detail in our final session. And then metrics and targets, as you can see there. So you've got, first up are the metrics used to assess risks and opportunities. And some of these are being mandated by the international bodies, and others are being left to organizations to work out themselves. And then the second part of the metrics disclosures are actually disclosing your emissions, so your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And we touched on those different types of emissions briefly at the last session, but this is the place where you disclose them in your report. And then the final piece is describing the targets, which I mentioned. We are looking today again, I'm using the latest international guidance as a guide for this session. This is again, the international prototype that has come out from the International Sustainability Standards Board. So this is the one that's out for consultation at the moment. And it's the one that has started with the TCFD disclosures and then advanced those to make them more detailed and taken into account feedback. So I think it's the best thing to use as you're thinking about developing the standard. It will change again. We'll get a new version once that has gone through the consultation process, but you can start to see very clearly the direction of travel through this document. And you can just download this online. Just be careful if you are looking for this online, and I'll include a hyperlink when I send these slides around. There's a parallel exposure draft for sustainability related disclosures, which is broader than this one, which is for climate related disclosures. I know that's caught a lot of people out. So this is the strategy disclosure section. And again, the same points I've just been through on the slide there as a reminder. This is the original language from the TCFD. Now, I won't go through all the detail of this, but I've included it in the slide so you have it. This is the original wording in the TCFD recommendations that came out. And so it breaks strategy into these 3 different pieces. And I've just included this detail so that you can see some of the commentary, because it's useful to see how it's moved. For example, in the second recommendation B, which is the one that says that you need to be describing the impact of risks and opportunities on your business strategy and financial planning. And forgive me, I've got another screen here with a larger version, so forgive me for looking away for this one. You're being asked to consider including in your disclosures the impact on financial planning in specific areas, and they are operating costs and revenues, capital expenditures and capital allocation, acquisitions or divestments, and also access to capital. And so depending on which organization is doing the reporting, those different categories will be more or less important. And they will also range depending on whether you're disclosing a risk or an opportunity. And we'll see some really concrete examples in this session of how those are being disclosed already in the banking sector. So this is the overview of the Issb prototype, which is very similar to what I've just shown you from the TCFD. The Issb prototype strategy section runs to about 3 pages of quite dense text. So it's very prescriptive, and it's giving a lot of the expectations have really risen in terms of what is being asked in terms of disclosures. But this is the high level summary of what reporting entities need to do. And there's a few important changes here from TCFD, from the original TCFD draft. So the first one is describe the significant climate-related risks that could reasonably affect business model strategy and cash flows. So here we've got a little bit of a pragmatic approach coming across the Issb standard. They're not asking for sort of absolutely everything and everything possibly that might happen to your business as a result of climate change. They're asking very clearly for the significant risks that could reasonably affect your business model, strategy, and cash flows. And those 2 changes have been very well received by reporting entities that I've worked with, because they just give a little bit of reassurance that you're not being asked to do the impossible here, and that you are really supposed to be focusing on what's actually important to your business. And I think when you're working through the strategy section, reporting entities, you as a regulator, you can really encourage them that this is all about working out what are the really important impacts for them, not absolutely everything, and not investing resource into figuring absolutely every possible impact out. But what are the really big ones? What are the priority ones that are going to affect them? Where are there big opportunities from some of the impacts of transition to a net zero economy? Where are the big impacts that are going to cause them problems? And so then describing the impact of those risks and opportunities, and then resilience. So, and sorry, I should say the Issb prototype also requires you to disclose whether scenario analysis has been used to conduct this particular analysis of how resilient your strategy is. And what this requires is the reporting entity needs to choose a couple of scenarios, so climate change scenarios, looking into the future, that it thinks are reasonable benchmarks for what might happen. So you might choose a scenario which assumes a trajectory where we are continuing largely as current. So where you would have, relatively high temperature increases across the world, for example. And then you might choose a scenario where a reasonable amount of greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation takes place internationally. So you might assume a scenario with a 3-degree rise in temperature. So you're expecting that there is some reasonable correction internationally, emissions come down, but not to the degree that we are hoping for under the Paris Agreement, which is 1.5 to 2 degrees. And then what you do is you feed in a number of assumptions into the particular scenario you're using to make it relevant for your organization. And you can imagine that this is why this is the difficult part of TCFD reporting. And then you end up with usually 2 or 3 scenarios that you've chosen as being, reasonable forecasts of the future. And then you look at how your business would operate and would be performing in each of those 3 forecasts or scenarios. And then you analyze that. So that is the analysis of the scenario. That's the scenario analysis that is talked a lot about in this area. And you decide, well, if we had a particular scenario where emissions pricing, for example, had hit, this particular level, that might make your current business model unsustainable. And so that would be a very significant risk to you. So that if the world is heading down a particular scenario direction, that at that, by a certain date, you're going to really struggle because of the electricity cost at that point. The challenge in this and what a lot of reporting entities I work with are really struggling with at the moment is just figuring out what scenarios are available internationally, because there are some templates that have been developed, but some of them are better than others for different things, for different sectors, for different parts of the world. And I think one of the things I mentioned in my first session is that this is the piece as a regulator and as a government agency working to introduce TCFD reporting. I think one of the best things you can do is invest really early in resources to focus on developing template scenarios for your reporting entities in Mexico, and get that work stream up and running alongside developing the reporting scheme. Because as soon as you get the reporting scheme up and running, the first question all of your reporting entities are going to come to you with will be, where are the climate scenarios that we should be using? Which are the ones that are relevant for Mexico? Give us some guidance. That's exactly what's been happening in the UK and New Zealand and around the world. And it's really difficult if you don't have, and the regulator doesn't have really any good guidance that it can give businesses, because otherwise they're having to all do this individually on their own, and it's really costly and really difficult, and you just don't get good disclosures unless you've sort of helped reporting entities along the journey with the scenario analysis. And then the final disclosure in the strategy section is a new one from where TCFD first started, and that's a requirement to disclose the entity's transition plan. And a transition plan it's similar to the strategy section of your disclosures, really, but it's putting in one place the things you are going to do to transition your business to reflect the climate assessment that you've done. And so in New Zealand, for example, we've got a national emissions target of net zero by 2050 for the whole economy. And so entities in New Zealand would be producing in a transition plan that explains how their business is going to move towards that net zero position by 2050. Mexico, I don't know what the exact commitment is, but it may be different, maybe slightly different to that. And it's important to make clear to reporting entities what sort of broader goal they're working to, so that when they're producing their transition plan, they sort of know what the landscape is and know where the benchmark is. So what I'm going to do now is go through a series of examples so that all of this starts making more sense. And I've picked up, as I did last time, a number of UK banks that are already producing voluntary disclosures and doing them in really different ways. And it's a really good example of all the different options that reporting entities have, and gives them a good sense of where they need to get to. So this is just a good straightforward summary of what Barclays, a bank in the UK, is doing to focus its climate strategy. So obviously, number one, it's achieving net zero emissions, but particularly in operation. So this is for the bank, and this is, I think, for the banking sector, something to be clear on really early on, is that it really does break down into these three categories for the banking sector. And this is what all of the banking reporting entities will be figuring out, is that number one, you want to be reducing your emissions from your operations, so from what the bank is actually doing on the ground, from its headquarters, the branches, the emissions from transport, from its employees getting to work, all of those operational emissions. That's number one to reduce. But number two is much more important, because of course the banking sector has this incredible role in financing a huge proportion more of emissions across the economy, but from all of its lending. And so number two is reducing financed emissions. And financed emissions is the area where there's been a lot of focus and a lot of investment in the last 12 to 18 months to develop international strategies to measure financed emissions in a way that's comparable between jurisdictions. And that was a lot of that has been led by PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, which I mentioned briefly in our first session. And PCAF has developed a methodology for calculating financed emissions across different asset classes. And you can see in the examples I've got today, a lot of banks, well, all of the big banks are reporting their financed emissions across their portfolio and then demonstrating how those financed emissions are reducing over time. Because to be frank, if the banks have, reduced their operational emissions, down to zero, but they haven't done anything on their financed emissions, then, they're not making anywhere near the amount of impact that they could have. So financed emissions is really the heart for the banking sector of strategy for TCFD. And then the third piece, which connects to reducing financed emissions, is financing the transition. And so this is the lending into so sustainable finance or lending that's connected to sustainability, or businesses that are progressing sustainable initiatives to enable the net zero transition. And this is where you get a lot of targets from banks which are claiming to be investing X billion in sustainable finance across the next 10 years, for example. And that's a really positive part of the disclosures. These are a set of examples of identified physical risks and transition risks from Barclays and their potential financial impacts. And this is sort of the first part of the strategy section for Barclays. So working out what actually is going to happen to the bank and its customers. And the bottom piece, the climate transition risks, these have been broken down, you'll remember from the first couple of sessions, into policy and regulatory risk, and then technology risk, and then legal risk. And the big one really here is the policy and regulatory risk for the bank's customers. So this is the carbon taxes, the tightening of energy efficiency standards, could lead in this case to increased credit risks of banking customers. And then here we are to another identified risk, which is legislators developing regulations around climate risk management, so climate stress testing, taxonomy, and disclosure. And that's certainly something that the Reserve Bank, or the national banking supervisor will be focused on for the banking sector. The next piece from Barclays, which I thought was a useful example, is how they're supporting their customers. And this is the part that the banks have really picked up on internationally as being how they can demonstrate their ability to be a positive part of this transition change. So all of the different things they can do across their different types of clients and customers to work with them. And you can see over here on the left, on the consumer side, increasing green home and buy-to-let mortgages, sustainable investing solutions. And then as you work over towards the corporates and the investors, you start to get, sustainable capital markets, ESG research, quantitative analysis, strategy on ESG trends, the kinds of things that the banks can do and can do at scale, and then can choose to assist some of their different clients across the spectrum, as they put it here. And that's a good cross-check for your new product development for banks, is looking at this range of options that that other banks internationally have already disclosed, and looking, well, we might be doing green mortgages on one side, but we're not investing in you know, the sustainable capital markets on the other, so this is just a good example of the range of options that are open to you. And then you can disclose that this is part of your strategy, is you are seizing these opportunities, and that's going to be a good thing for your bank, and that demonstrates that you are you know, across this developing you know, macro change and taking advantage of it, and that's going to reassure your investors. So that's all part of what TCFD is aiming at, is helping investors feel confident that you are managing both the risks and opportunities well. This is an example of the different scenarios that were used by Barclays, and this is a pretty standard disclosure in that they've chosen 3 different scenarios which are based on what is described as an early and orderly transition, and that is a transition where, as it says, you have, you know, regulation and taxes and policies well organized and put in place early so that internationally temperature increase is limited and businesses have confidence around the changing regulatory environment. Compare that to the second one, which is a late and disorderly transition, which is where no one does anything for ages, and then you suddenly have a bunch of snap policy changes which have a, you know, a negative impact on business. But you still get to the same temperature outcome, because everything happens, but just happens really fast and really late. And then in this one, they've got a third option as well. But the sort of, I just wanted to point out that the orderly and disorderly transition are they're the scenarios that are often used to take into account both the physical changes from climate change, so the forecast, you know, temperature, sea level rise, all the physical impacts, as well as the transition impacts, so the way that regulation is going to change. And, you know, I'm working with a fund manager at the moment, which is trying to figure out the scenarios it should use to understand its risk across all of its investments and all of its portfolios. And it's really difficult, because, you know, you have to get across this kind of scenario work globally for all of its global investments. And, you know, that is not at all straightforward, and you know, reporting entities are just figuring this out as they go. I'll just skip through to another bank, so you've got a different example. So this is a NatWest one. This is their sort of overall, you know, highlights of their strategy, everything that they're doing, various net zero targets, and you know, different amounts of financing, etc. This is their sort of, you know, headline page for their strategy disclosure. And then this is a relatively sort of simple breakdown, but it's quite useful. So they have identified at the bottom there the risks, and then on the left the opportunities. And I think the bottom here, it is very simplified, but it's quite useful. So they're saying we've got 4 key risks: credit risk, potential increase in impairments, so people not paying their loans back, operational risk, the business disruption costs from, you know, increased flooding across all of their operations, reputational risk if they're not seen to be doing enough and get sued or targeted on social media or start to lose customers to other banks, and then conduct risk and regulatory compliance. And there they've included development of new products and services. And then they flow through into their various opportunities, which are standard, similar to one of the ones we've seen before. And then again, this is just a different way of splitting the transition risks, the physical risks, similar to the Barclays example we just saw, which I will just leave so you have as an example, but it's just another way of demonstrating. So they've split the potential events from the potential impact. And that's a useful, simplified way of doing this. You can see, and this is you know, something that we see in the banking sector a lot now, that the transition risks are much more significant and coming on earlier than the physical risks. And I think that's something to get across to reporting entities as you're building capacity, that they need to be across the regulatory change and the reputational market shifts a lot earlier than actually seeing any physical shifts. And for banks, so for lending to the property investments, for example, or residential mortgages, the classic example there is that for properties exposed to flooding or extreme wind speeds, for example, you're going to see, and sea level rise is the classic example, you're going to see a pullback on insurance and a pullback on local regulatory bodies providing services to properties on the coast well before you actually get waves sweeping up and causing damage to houses. Okay, it's going to be it's the regulatory impacts that are going to, or market impacts like a lack of insurance, that are going to cause problems for banks in terms of the security of their lending much earlier than any actual physical changes, and that's reflected in the metrics that we'll see soon. Here's another one where I've just given an example of, again, the impact of these risks that have been identified. And I won't go through all of this, but this is another useful summary of what they're doing. So one, I'll just pull out, one is that they've got this stated ambition to stop lending and underwriting to companies with more than 15% of activities related to thermal coal, unless they had a plan in place with the Paris, in line with reducing emissions aligned with the Paris Agreement. So they're getting very specific about how they are reducing their financed emissions. This is another good one, focusing on all the different key opportunities that NatWest was taking up. And this is another way of cutting the data that we saw before, but the big one is accelerating the transition to net zero. And so here they are supporting UK mortgage customers to increase their energy efficiency. Then they're creating products and services to track their carbon impact, and then reducing the carbon intensity of funds by 50% by 2030. So just starting to break down how they're actually getting towards these bigger goals, which is quite useful. Here you can see the second one under the blue says, we plan to phase out of coal for UK and non-UK customers who have coal-fired generation, coal-related infrastructure by 2024, with a global phase out by 2030. And that's pretty similar. A lot of banks have actually, if they can, they've moved faster than that. It depends how exposed they are. And that's a big one to get across early, because that's a metric. The coal phase out is one that's compared often between banks. There's a few sort of key issues that the banks can get across early, and I'm sure already are starting to work this through. This is on the opportunity side. So I wanted to draw your attention to here the impact column. So they're explaining the impact of the work that they are doing. Similar thing again from Lloyd's is another example. So you can see here the kinds of sort of statistics that they're putting out. And then here again, we've got another example of how to identify the different risks split between these different areas. So here again, you've got a big focus on the left on the transition risk, and then physical risk at the bottom. And, one of the first ones, which is a good example, is the key risk in the policy and legal sector is impacts from government policies, e.g. energy efficiency standards or the transition to electric vehicles. And they've got a big motor vehicle lending portfolio. And so they're particularly focused on the transition to electric vehicles and what that's going to do for their lending in that sector. Lloyd's has a good example showing the difference between financed emissions and their own operational emissions, which is the blue and the yellow here, and I'll come back to that when I get down to the metrics section. And I'll just skip through these. I'll leave these are just some further examples, but I'll just skip through given I want to get through the metrics and targets work. I might just stop there briefly and invite Richard if you had any comments on the strategy disclosures, if you wanted to jump in. Don't worry if I'm putting you on the spot.
No worries, Nicola, and hello everybody, and my apologies for not turning on my camera. I'm actually at the airport in Berlin in Germany at the moment, and as I've been here on business, so that's why my camera isn't on. I mean, just a couple of points, Nicola. I thought that was great and very thorough talking through on strategy. I just had a couple of points. One on scenario analysis, and actually there's an interesting question that's come up there as well in terms of, you know, who within the company might take that decision about scenario analysis. But I just want to say my experience working with energy companies and financial institutions, investors on TCFD and what they say on strategy is that the International Energy Agency, their scenarios are often used as what are called reference scenarios by investors and energy companies, and you'll be very familiar with this, Nicola. And an interesting thing to watch, I think, will be whether investors are expecting companies more to use the IEA's net zero scenario, which was published last summer in 2021, in line with 1.5 degrees. So I think that's an interesting point to look at. Then the other thing, just Nicola, you mentioned transition plans, and transition plans, it looks like they're going to be coming into regulation in the UK. In other words, to be mandatory for companies from next year. That is the talk at the moment, which has been coming out from the Finance Ministry. And Mark Carney, whom Nicola, you talked at the outset of these sessions. You know, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, has been so instrumental in terms of driving TCFD. He has talked a lot about the need for transition plans to reveal more what investors and companies are doing. So there we are, just a couple of additions there. Thanks, Nicola.
No, brilliant. Thanks so much, Richard. Okay, so metrics and targets. We've gone through the basics of this already, so I want to get to some of the good examples. Again, I've put in the slide pack here, this is the original TCFD language, and then this is the ISSB prototype. So there are three types of metrics that are being talked about internationally. There's cross-industry metrics, which are applied to everyone, regardless of which industry you're in. Industry-based metrics, which are specific to particular industries. And there's a range of these industry-based metrics that are proposed in schedules to the ISSB protocol. So you can click through to the particular sector and see the ones that are proposed for commercial banking, for example, is one of the schedules that is included in that ISSB protocol. And then the third category is other metrics that are being used by management within the business to measure progress. So, you know, your particular business might have a particular metric which is really relevant, that's being used that others, you know, don't need to use. And a good example I saw recently is fish survival or death rates in offshore farming of fish in waters where the temperature is rising. And obviously the mortality rate of the fish is a really critical metric for those businesses, but obviously irrelevant to many others. So some specific metrics by business, and then targets. These are the list of cross-industry metrics that are being proposed in the ISSB standard. And these are the ones that they would expect everyone to be disclosing, you know, as far as it makes sense. So scope 1 to 3 gross emissions. So that's not just scope 1 and 2, it's including scope 3 emissions too. And for banks, the large bulk of that are the financed emissions. GHG emissions intensity, which I'll show a couple of examples of, and then the percentage and amount of assets vulnerable to transition and physical risks. That's a really important one for businesses with thinking about their asset management plans. And the difficulty here is working out what does vulnerable mean. And for a bank, there's a lot of discussion at the moment around whether vulnerability simply refers to the properties that, say, you lend against that are exposed to sea level rise, or whether you're also having to take into account your assessment of your customers, the borrower's ability to repay a mortgage on a property that might be exposed to change. So you have to decide whether it includes just the exposure to the property from a physical sense, or whether you're also taking into account the customer's adaptive capacity to respond. And that includes an assessment of their other assets that they might be able to use to help pay back one loan that might be overexposed. So vulnerability is something that is going to get a lot more focus, and that's really still developing. Then the percentage of revenue or assets that are aligned with opportunities. So how much focus you're putting on opportunities. The capital deployed towards investment in risks and opportunities. If you're using an internal emissions price, excuse me, what that is. And if your board or management's remuneration is linked to climate risks and opportunities, you know, if you have a 2% increase in remuneration if the business hits its climate KPIs, then you should disclose that as well. And then on targets, the ask is that these are, you can't just give a target with no backup or no detail about it. You need to describe how that target's been calculated. You know, if you're stating that you're reducing your emissions by 30% by 2030, you need to say when you started. So is it 30% from this year or another year? And how that's being calculated, and whether you've had a third party involved in verifying those calculations. I'll just skip that. We're going to look at materiality in our next session. So this was the financed emissions that I said I'd explain. So a very simple example of financed emissions you can see on the right-hand side here. So if you've got an investment of £160 million into a company which has an enterprise value of £4,000 million, and that company has emissions of 2.8 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per annum, then you are responsible for a small percentage of that total amount of emissions. And it's worked out here that you're responsible for 0.1 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions for your lending to that particular business. So you're not responsible for all of their emissions, you're only responsible for the piece of your lending. And this type of calculation, and you can imagine there's a lot of detail around how to do this for different types of business and different asset classes, that comes from the PCAF methodology. And what it's a very small font the bank has worked out here is that 0.1 metric tons of financed emissions is also equivalent in this case to 700 tons of carbon per 1 million of investment into the business. And that's a measure of emissions intensity. So you often see financed emissions, which are an absolute number, an absolute disclosure of carbon emissions. They are often disclosed alongside an emissions intensity figure. And if I skip to this example, this is from Lloyd's, and I think this is a really great one. Here, they're disclosing their ambitions, their targets for reducing their financed emissions across different sectors. And I've pulled out here, they want to reduce their financed emissions from their lending to the oil and gas sector to 3.9 metric tons of carbon in total. And they want to reduce their in this case, they're using a measure of physical emissions intensity. So they're saying for our UK motor finance lending, we want to reduce the physical emissions intensity of our lending to, for cars, 65 grams of carbon per kilometre travelled. So you can see that by using that metric, they are actually disclosing how the physical end product that they are investing in, how they want that to change to reduce absolute carbon emissions over time. And that's really positive that they're doing that, and it shows that the bank and its financed emissions and its lending is taking responsibility for the actual physical measure. Now, when we compare this is from, what I've done here is I've pulled from another section of their report to compare what they're actually doing. And you can see up in the orange here, this is their 2019 financed emissions for motor finance. And so they're reporting physical emissions intensities of 129 grams of carbon per kilometre travelled for cars. So if I just flick back to the other screen, see their target 65 and their current metric is they're at 129 as an emissions intensity measure. So they've got a journey to go on there. You can see down in the blue, here are their actual financed emissions from the oil and gas sector. They've got 7.0 metric tonnes of carbon for 2019. And if you go back here, they're aiming for 3.9, which you can see is a 50% reduction. So that's a really good example of how these metrics can be used both as targets and as reporting metrics. And you can see that banks have some choices as to which metrics they're going to use. And, there is some gaming to be had here in the metrics that they are using. And so as a regulator, getting across the detail of these different metrics early to work out if you want to mandate particular metrics or if you want to leave that choice up to reporting entities, that's really important. And it really does make a difference between different sectors. You can also see on this slide, I thought was also interesting, in the green box, this is the financed emissions and emissions intensity of business banking and commercial banking. So for business banking, they've only got 0.3 metric tonnes of financed emissions in total, but their emissions intensity is 208 tonnes of carbon per $1 million invested. When you look at their commercial banking, they've got much higher financed emissions, so 16 metric tonnes. It means that the carbon from their commercial banking customers the carbon that's being emitted is a lot more than what they're getting from their business banking customers. But you can see that the emissions intensity from their commercial banking is actually lower. So it's suggesting that although they're lending a lot, there's a lot more carbon coming out, it's more efficient carbon, just as a comparison between those two portfolios. So that was Lloyd's. Barclays are doing a similar thing. So they're reporting here, their metrics are their absolute emissions, which is effectively their financed emissions. They're reflecting their emissions intensity for the power sector, and then they're reflecting different percentages for energy and power, and then a breakdown of CO2 emissions attributed to forms of financing, so another form of financed emissions. And then on the opportunities side, they're disclosing their $1 billion of green financing facilitated and investment in green innovation. So, and then their scope 1 to 3 emissions. So again, sort of relatively similar, but perhaps not as specific as Lloyd's has done. Here are some more metrics from Barclays showing the trending down of their financed emissions between their energy sector and their power sector. So they're drawing a difference there between the different sectors that they're financing. And here you can see, here's their emissions intensity that I've called out in the orange window here, reducing significantly down from 2019 down to 2021. So you can see that what they've probably done is stopped lending to coal in that space of time to reduce it that significantly. This is on the opportunities side, another way of showing this is their green financing. split between what they're doing at the moment and what their targets are. And then here's them splitting it all another way and looking at the percentage of their total financing going to different sectors. And they've pulled out here the mining, oil and gas sector. They're saying 8% of their total financing is going to that sector. And then they're looking at breaking it down. You can see they've got, 6% going into exploration and development, oil and gas, which is this is where a good example of what might be material for particular users. The fact that you are financing any oil and gas exploration and development, even if it's only a small amount, that might be really significant for a particular user. This is the same similar reporting, but from NatWest. So you can see the metrics being used here. Again, different exposures to different risk sectors. Again, they've got their own operational footprint and then estimates of financed emissions and emissions intensities in the orange box there. And here they've got proportion of properties at high risk of flooding by region across the UK. I thought this was a particularly good representation of showing where the risk is. You can see in the south of England there, that's where you've got the highest degree of risk by flooding. And then here's another example of the opportunity side. So their renewable energy green bond portfolio, different types of underwriting business that they're doing, etc. And I just wanted to, there's a, this is another quite a good one. So this is their, for NatWest, all of the different types of metrics that they're using pulled together. So you can see here they're splitting between their scope 1 and 2 emissions, their scope 3 emissions. They're using intensity ratios that, they're doing all sorts of different, using all sorts of different metrics here. I think, that's very thorough, but it's a lot more difficult to understand as a user. So part of what you're doing as you're encouraging reporting entities to get across this is thinking about how these metrics are going to be understood by users. And I think by looking at these kind of examples, you can really see where the effective disclosures are so that users have a sense of how across the particular reporting entity is of its climate risk exposure, both on the risk side and the opportunity side. Now I'm conscious we started just a little bit late, so I'm very happy to stay online and just pick up any particular questions. I also just wanted to flag that we've got one more session next time, and what I'd like to do with that session is cover a couple of specific topics and sort of look at how to get this reporting scheme up and running, but then leave a decent amount of time for questions across all of the sessions. And I really encourage, if you can send any of those to me in advance, then I can be better prepared and have some examples for you. Same with Rich as well.
Hi, Nicola. Just to say, there's been some great questions coming from Laura of GGGI that maybe one or two might, as you were saying, you might want to pick up in next week's session. I mean, there was one question about who should take the decision within an entity on reference scenarios. Should it be management board or perhaps the risk management people? Then also a question about greenwashing here on the reporting. And I wondered if that might be more of a materiality question to be addressed next week. And then what can be done from the bank side to foster suppliers to, for example, to share information. So some really good on-point questions, I thought.
Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I apologize, I didn't realize they were coming through, but just on the greenwashing, it's a really good question. And the one of the main things that reporting entities are being more aware of that I've worked with is not disclosing more than you can actually justify, and disclosing really carefully the assumptions that have gone into the numbers you're disclosing. And that's something that I've seen a shift in TCFD reports that have been published, the early ones were very happy to publish big targets and big numbers and not a lot of detail. And the ones being published now are much more constrained in terms of what they are publishing and what they're saying is they're basing those numbers on, and what they might need government to be doing in order for them to reach their own targets. That's often a way that targets are being couched. So greenwashing is a very real risk, and increasingly so. And one thing I thought we might cover next week is some of the guidance that the regulators are giving to avoid greenwashing, because as a group of individuals thinking about this from a regulatory perspective, as you get the TCFD regulation up and running, it's also great to have some parallel guidance on avoiding greenwashing so that reporting entities know what their expectations are.
And just, Laura, that question about who would make the decision inside the company about scenario analysis, reference scenarios. Well, I mean, my experience, I mean, as Nicola said earlier, that the strategy section of the TCFD report really goes to the heart of what the company, what the entity is doing, in relation to their business strategy, their business model, and so on. And I mean, my recommendation, I don't know what you think, Nicola, is it may well be the responsible sustainability or chief risk officer looking at this, but that's the sort of decision, in terms of scenario analysis, what reference scenarios to use, that I think, senior management need to be involved in that as well, because this is the sort of thing that investors look all over. I don't know what you think, Nicola, but that's my experience.
Yes, I think you usually have someone in the business who's a technical expert who's pulling together the range of options, and often with the scenarios, it sort of becomes clear that some of them are going to be relevant and others just not relevant for the particular business. So you might go to the executive management with a recommendation of, we think we should use these 3, and here are the 7 or 8 that we've considered in detail, and then you'd explain, we think these ones are more relevant for our business for these reasons. But there's a lot of technical work in the background there to get to that position, and I think the board would likely sign off on it, but for my work, it's more something that is done at a technical level with a recommendation up to management, just because it's such a technical area, and there's no right answer, and businesses sometimes sort of pick and choose between, they'll choose the international energy scenarios, and then they'll choose some other ones to compare to. So there's no sort of one way of doing it. The Network for Greening the Financial System, which is the global banking regulator collaboration, has released its own scenarios too, and they'll be really relevant for this audience. So I might try and put some links to those in the next session. Let's make a note. So any other questions, we'll pick up on anything else in the final session, and any other questions, please do. If you want to put them in the chat now, we can just keep a record of them and then answer them next week. So to go ahead and do that, or send them through and we can answer them.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, and thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for your attendance today. So we will finish next week. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Gabby, are you still there?
Hi, Nicola. Yes, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you doing? Are you doing all right?
Fine, thank you. Yes, I'm fine already. What about you? How was COVID?
Yeah, it was definitely hit me for a good week. So
yeah,
I'm still just coming right slowly. Yeah.
Yeah, I got it. It was exactly the same for me. Only 1 week, that which is fine.
Yeah, no, that's right. Oh, well, I'm pleased to hear you back again. And I was just going to stay on at the end just to say, please do maybe encourage everyone to, if they have any questions, particularly off the back of this session, to send them through, so that I've sort of deliberately left some space in that fourth session to be able to, work through questions arising. So if there's anything you think, would be really useful to cover, please do let me know, and then, in the next few days, and then I can prepare it for next session.
Yeah, thank you. I think that maybe we can ask them to send the questions through email, and we can send them to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be brilliant.
Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
Not only for the CNBV, but also with some banks that are also joining us in the session. So I will tell them.
Okay, that sounds really good. Brilliant. All right, Gabby. Okay, and we'll I'll see you next week.
Yes, I'm not sure if you did you receive the link directly to your email to join as a panelist. I'm not sure if you received it.
Ah, I figured out what had happened. So when you sent me the 2 links in the email, the second one for the 4th session was the registration link. And so when I registered, it then gave me the Zoom link. But for the 3rd session, you'd given me just the Zoom link, but it didn't work because, of course, I hadn't registered. So I really needed the registration link. But luckily, I found it in my emails from ages ago, and so when I found it in my emails for the registration for the 3rd section, when I clicked on that, it then let me in. So that was fine. So I think next week should be fine because I've got the registration link for the 4th session rather than the Zoom link. So I think that should work fine.
Yeah, but I think that you are for the next session, that link also give you access, but as an attendee, a general attendee. If you join the session, I just I can promote you directly to a panelist. But but let me check. Maybe I can send you the link, the direct link to join as a panelist. So let me check.
Okay, that sounds good. And either way, I'll just join. I'll try and log on at 10:02 so that if it doesn't work, we can sort it out. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Nicola. Okay. And if we receive some questions, I am happy to send them to you. Okay, great. Brilliant. Okay, thanks very much. Nice to see you, Gabby. Have a nice day. Okay, you too. Bye. Bye.